Hello and welcome. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. It's the second day of December 2021, which means it's also the second day of Vlogmas 2021. And it's also the second day of the Yogcast Jingle Jam 2021. So if you're feeling generous this holiday and want to donate to a worthy charity, head on over to the yogcasttwitch.com and donate to one of the many charities that they are supporting this year for Jingle Jam. Or you could just directly support my charity of choice, Team Primetime, here in Los Angeles, California, celebrating its 21st year, I believe, 22nd year that I've been a member of the Team Primetime program, and this program has been going on. It's a charity I very much support and is close to my heart. Or you could support me directly by subscribing to my vlog if you haven't yet and helping me hit 1,000 subs. As part of Vlogmas, we like to do challenges, like show Christmas decorations, or show baking cookies, or go caroling. Or if you're a gamer like me, you find a 30-day challenge to go through talking about your least favorite things about the hobby. And the first question of these challenges is usually, how did I get started playing the hobby? So how did I, the OG GM, get started playing this hobby 40 some odd years ago? And my introduction to the hobby is actually pretty backwards compared to most. And it's sort of it's not a straight line. It's sort of this roundabout, weird mush that led me to where I am today. So let's turn the Wayback Machine way back to the 70s, 1976, 1977, somewhere in there. Now, Dungeons & Dragons was out, and it was sort of, I had heard of it. I don't remember exactly how I'd heard of it, but I knew on some level it was out there. I didn't know what it was. Now, I was already getting into fantasy. I was reading The Lord of the Rings and watching anything I could on, TV about fantasy and Saturday morning cartoons and, of course, Star Wars. And, I was already a geek. I pretty much was born a geek. I don't know why. Just my very first memories are of, comic books and superheroes and toys and fantasy, probably because, being born with dyslexia and depression and just being picked on even that early in my life. So escaping into the fantasy. So the materials were there. So I can still remember it clearly to this day, which is weird because there's so many other aspects to this story that are, maybe this happened, I remember this correctly, or maybe I just made it up. I can remember it clearly. We were at the Glendale Galleria with my biological father for some reason, probably shopping for clothes. And there's a store, and I can even remember what side of it is on the store. It's on my right-hand side as we're walking in, and it's called the Fantasy Garden. And it's a little teeny 10 by 10, 12 by 12 storefront with, what we would call today a pop-up. The shelves were just all shelves, and then one little cash register. And the shelves were all those little pewter figures that were really popular in the 70s of the dragons sitting on the crystal, or the little pewter frog, or the little pewter thing. And then there was also some war game figures there. It was all pewter and lead figures that were available at the time. And most of them were in some way or other fantasy related. So you had the pewter dragons, the pewter frog, the little pixies that were out, garden gnomes, and you had some 1975, 1976 war game figs. You had these figures from pewter figures from The Hobbit, the party of the Hobbit, and you had some of the very early lead figures that were available for Dungeons and Dragons. And I was just captivated so much that I can still see it to this day. I can still see the window, left-hand side, walking into the Glendale Galleria from the second floor parking lot. There it is, walking in this all-white building, all these shelves, one little cash register, one little guy, I don't even remember, and just these figures. So 3 walls of just 4 shelves of just pewter figures, pewter dragons. And I was just captivated in that world. I just wanted to see these figures. I just wanted to know everything about them. I don't remember how long I was in there, because I know my brother and my dad, biological father, just continued in their shopping and said they'd come back for me. And I was just lost in these figs. And I'm very shy and I'm very antisocial, so I don't even say anything. And then we leave, and I just could not get them out of my mind. And I'm like begging, I want to go back and see this store again. Please, please, please. So the next time we're with our, biological father, and this is, of course, during my parents' divorce, so we only get to see him like every other weekend. Please, can we go to the Galleria? Can I see these again? So he breaks down, takes us to the Galleria again, and the store's still there. And I just walk in, and again, I'm just instantly lost in these dragons, these figures, this whole amazing little world. And finally, I get up enough nerve to ask the store owner, where are these from? And he tells me, well, have you ever heard of Dungeons and Dragons? He doesn't, say, oh, these are from miniature war games, and those are the pewter little dragons, and those are lead figures from, Monopoly and some alternate German version, and, whatever was available out then. Because there were pewter figures and lead figures being made that had nothing to do with Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, fantasy figures were just all, a thing. There was always dragons and pixies and scantily clad barmaids, and plus the miniature games were already in existence. So you had little miniature soldiers and little miniature tanks and little miniature whatever, World War II, and there were a couple fantasy ones or medieval ones. So there had knights and archers, and of course the very beginning of the Dungeons and Dragons figures. But they weren't all for D&D. Though they could have obviously used for D&D, and he said they're for Dungeons and Dragons. Have you heard of it? And as I said, I had heard of it, but I didn't really know what it was. I just know I wanted these figures. But I also wanted G.I. Joes and Matchboxes and the early Japanese toys that we were starting to see. I was just fascinated with toys, with small little things, with the imaginary world, G.I. Joe. So, without really knowing what it is, of course, I asked Santa, my parents, get me Dungeons & Dragons for Christmas. And I get the original books, Greyhawk, Men, Myth, and Magic, the original beige color white box books. And I try and teach myself D&D. And the only person I really have to play D&D with at that time is my brother, or I'm playing by myself. I don't really understand it. I get people to buy me the stuff, or I buy the things myself with my allowance. There's a toy store where we live that's beginning to carry the very beginnings of D&D stuff. I don't know what any of this is because there's nobody actually telling me, and I'm sort of reading through the book, but not really reading through it, just sort of making shit up and sort of trying to figure out what it is, And the only person I have to really play with is my brother, and then there's this kid down the block. And we're sort of playing D&D together, but not really. It's just sort of more like just collective storytelling, and nobody really knows anything about the rules. And, you're asking everybody you run into at the toy store or at the comic book store back then in Studio City, and trying to find other people to play. So I would say, even though I have technically been playing the game since 1974, 76, I didn't really play Dungeons and Dragons with other people as written. I don't know what, there was obviously days where we'd sit around with me and this kid and his brother, or me and my brother, and tell these stories and roll dice. But, we didn't know what it was. We had character sheets, but they were ridiculous. Like, he had his character sheet on the 3x5 card. It was called Fred the Elf. And, it was just, nobody really knew what we were doing. And then Villains and Vigilantes shows up in my life. And I don't remember who got it first. I don't remember if I got it first because I saw the superheroes. I think I got it first. I think I had Villains and Vigilantes, the original edition, and Superhero 2024, because I remember rules that were in a game that then the second edition came out, those rules were gone, and I remembered, like, what happened to the homemade hero? Or maybe I'm just making this shit up. I don't know. I don't know how much of this is real or how much of this is just nostalgia and I'm not remembering correctly. But I know that Villains and Vigilantes somehow got introduced to our little group of 2-3 people. And that's really when I started playing. That's really when I got in and learned a rule set and met other people and started going to conventions with friends and started hanging out at the comic book shop. So technically, even though I had D&D and had been quote-unquote playing D&D, I didn't really start playing a role-playing game by the rules and actually learning the rules and finding other people to play with at like the park or the library or even at school until Villains and Vigilantes. And most of my gaming from that point on until the mid-'80s was Villains and Vigilantes. I didn't really start playing D&D as written with other people to advanced. And then I met Tom Lindgreen, and we started playing some D&D then. And so everything up through high school is 80% Villains and Vigilantes, 20% D&D, 10% other games, mostly superhero games, some homebrew games. We're playing Traveler. We're playing the Fantasy Trip. We're all writing our own games. Occasionally, I'll play D&D with Tom Lindgreen and these other guys. And then these other guys over at the park and whatever, we're playing Villains and Vigilantes. We did a convention at the park where we ran Pharaoh, and we had 5 different DMs and 5 different tables running the tournament of Pharaoh. We went to conventions in LA at Strategicon over at the Hyatt Wyndham. We went to the very first convention. This is the story where I ended up buying Orange County. There was an attempt to cross-pollinate D&D with sci-fi convention and Star Trek convention. It was a total mess. And I'm playing D&D with Tom. And then I go to college. And pretty much nobody at my college is playing Dungeons & Dragons. They're playing Villains and Vigilantes. I get into a Villains and Vigilante group with Barry Osser that goes on for almost 4 years. They're playing a lot of weird homebrew games. Then we start playing Twilight 2000, and then, of course, GURPS comes along, and just everybody converts to GURPS. So for most of my college, it was GURPS and Villains and Vigilantes and a little Cyberpunk and occasionally 1 or 2 other games and a lot of homebrews. There was a homebrew time travel game. There was a couple of homebrew superhero games. There was a homebrew fantasy game. We played a lot of Aftermath and Gamma World, but mostly it was Villains and Vigilantes and GURPS. Then I leave college, come back to Los Angeles, hook up again with Tom Lindgreen, try and find people to play, the only game I really want to, Villains and Vigilantes. And that's when I meet TJ Storm. And I think I've told this story before about how I met TJ Storm at a convention, how he killed my character, and how that began a 1989 through 2021 year friendship with World Martial Arts Hall of Fame member TJ Storm. And that's how I got into the 15-year-long D&D campaign that was Company of the Bull. So everything after college to the time I moved up here to Ventura was once a week, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, becoming, 2nd edition, becoming 3rd edition, going into 3.5 edition, playing with TJ Storm, Company of the Bull, Myron Nagadine, then Manetho, then back to Myron Nagadine, then back to Manetho, then a couple other characters. We played a few, we would break off and play Marvel a couple times, but mostly it was 15 years of Dungeons & Dragons with TJ Storm running the game, playing with Josh and John and Charles and Rochelle and Jay. And then there was the whole Kerry Solomon, late 80s, early 90s Forge bullshit that pretty much ruined the group. And I regret my involvement with the Forge and stuff. And then I didn't play for a while. And then I moved up here and pretty much has been playing Pathfinder and 5th edition ever since, with occasional forays into homebrews and other games. Tristan Marks's year-long Pokemon game, Tristan Marks's almost year-long space game, Matt Bromund's many attempts to run Pathfinder in 5th edition, but yeah, mostly D&D, and then of course we get to COVID, and then I'm not playing anything until recently. I ran during the summer a space game, and now I'm running a game over at Cess Games and Anime on Tuesdays, which is basically OSR basic fantasy role-playing game with some modifications to fit what we wanted to play. Which brings us to today. So yeah, it's a very weird, nonsensical, non-linear story that brings me to this moment and how I got started and where I am now. But literally, even though I owned Dungeons & Dragons when it first came out, the first game I actually played would have been Villains and Vigilantes. So my first D&D actual group, weekly group, would have been with Tom Lindgreen and those guys, Ben and a couple others, and myself and Jason Dante, every week or every other week playing D&D, and then going to college and playing Villains and Vigilantes and GURPS, and then coming back to LA. And then that's really, really the 15-year-long relationship at Dungeons & Dragons with TJ and that group. And then coming up here and playing mostly 3.5 into Pathfinder, into 5th. And, of course, the constant flux of homebrews and other games like Call of Cthulhu, Villains and Vigilantes, Champions, GURPS, playtesting GURPS, my love affair with Cyberpunk, and just non-stop nonsense. But if we look at the big benchmarks of gaming for me, it's Villains and Vigilantes, GURPS, Dungeons & Dragons, homebrews, which brings us to today. So that is the very weird story of how I started playing and where I am today in my gaming. Of course, in there, I published a whole bunch of games and wrote a whole bunch of games and worked for a whole bunch of game companies and made some movies and got published for some poetry and did a lot of other stuff. But that's mainly my history of gaming. And yeah, it's pretty weird when you look at it. And it's weird that how I can still remember that store. I can still remember certain moments that define my gaming history. I can still remember meeting TJ. I can still remember meeting Matt. I can still remember going to the game club at my college and meeting Barry Osser and my, not 40 some odd year friendship with him. Let's say I met him at 18 and I'm 55. So whatever that is, So it's weird. It's definitely weird. And the Dungeons & Dragons family I have made and have lost, and the ones I'm still in touch with, and the ones I've lost contact with, and the ones I wish I still talk with, is weird. So yeah, shout out to Tom Lindgreen, shout out to TJ Storm, shout out to Matt Bromund, shout out to Jay Willis, wherever he is, shout out to Barry Osser and Matt Keating, shout out again, Josh Maximum, John DeRose, Rochelle, Charles, all the other guys that I played in the 15-year campaign. Of course, that is just the largest chunk of my gaming life is either that or up here playing with Matt Bromund. So yeah, there we go. If you appreciate this story and want to hear more, let me know. If you never want to hear stuff like this ever again, let me know. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. Help me reach 1,000 subs by January 1st, and I will, as promised, plug the camera in, show the cat, and I don't know, maybe cut my hair into a mohawk or eat some ghost peppers or whatever else you do at 1,000 subs challenges, or give something away. Lord knows I've got enough crap to give away. Till next time, I have been your holiday Grinch guide to all the nonsense that is Vlogmas. Let me know what's going on. Stay safe, stay warm, stay healthy, stay happy. Thank you for listening to me talk for 20 minutes. Now get off my lawn.